All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of our mobility solutions. Earlier, I promised you some interesting ways of looking at things, and I think if we look in the rearview mirror for a moment, we can think about some of the assumptions that businesses have made that, frankly, no longer hold true. One of the biggest assumptions we made is, well, we own the network. So if we protect the network, if we secure the network, we'll be fine. Because if no one can get on my network other than those that I allow, all of my data will be safe. We went for many years with that assumption in place. The reality of it is now is we don't know what network our users are using. After the network, we started thinking about, well, let's protect the device. Let's put whole disk encryption on there. We'll only allow certain devices. We know what the MAC addresses are. We can lock down based on the network, based on the device. These are two big assumptions that really just don't work in an era of mobility. And if these are the only two assumptions that we're making, if this is how we're choosing to approach security, there are so many different vectors that spoil this sort of approach. I don't necessarily own the network. I don't know what network my users are on. Are they on the Starbucks network? Are they on their home Wi-Fi network? Are they on our corporate office network? The device, I no longer necessarily own the device. I no longer necessarily know what the device is. I no longer even know necessarily, as we were just hearing, what apps are they using? What operating systems are they using? And so these assumptions, too, just don't work anymore. What we need to do is think about the apps and the data. Because at the end of the day, that's really what's important. I mean, yes, to the extent that we're worried about a $500 device, not that $500 isn't a lot of money, but at the end of the day, that's not really what's important. Whoop. Are we still there? Just a second here. What's really important is our ability to protect our corporate information. And so protecting the apps and the data is really the way to go. And what's interesting about this approach is if I start on the left, I don't necessarily have security or protection for those things that I care about on the right, my apps and the data. However, if I protect the apps and the data, then I care a lot less about what network someone's using. I care a lot less about what device they're using, because I know more at the atomic level, I've protected my data, I've protected the apps that I'm providing my users. And so clearly, this provides us flexibility not only with regard to the network and the device, but it provides us flexibility with regard to who we are supporting, those business partners, those consumers, those customers, those employees. So I mentioned containers earlier. We're obviously big proponents of containers because they allow us to separate the corporate and the personal data without having that artificial fence that assumes that, well, now I'm working and now I'm doing personal stuff. Containerization allows us to maintain that user experience that somebody chose. I chose an Android device because I like a specific user experience. I expect the apps to behave in a certain way. The same applies to Windows Phone. The same applies to iOS. We don't want to interrupt that. Years of security practice will tell us the moment your employees, your users, feel like you're getting in their way, like you're making it harder for them to do their job, that's the moment that they start finding ways around the system. They're not malicious. They're just trying to get their job done. And so we don't want to disrupt that user experience. We want app-level encryption and authentication. We want it independent of the OS. So iOS offers, for example, encryption on board the device. The problem is, even if your users are using that 4-digit PIN, as soon as they've authenticated to the device, everything on that device is now available in the clear. So if you're allowing business information and personal information to reside in that device, as soon as they authenticate, everything is now available. Think about the classic, for those of you who have kids, how many of us haven't handed a mobile phone to a child at a restaurant while we're waiting for food to show up so that we can have a moment of peace and quiet? Well, as soon as I unlock the code, they've got access to Angry Birds, sure, but they've got access to my business email as well if I'm not so protected. And so we want app-level data access policy. We want policies that control who gets access to the apps as well as who gets access to the specific data. And we want to control this by perhaps user group, by specific individual, whether they're an employee or not. We want to make sure that we're protecting ourselves from very common threats, things like jailbreaking and rooting on Android devices. Because as soon as you have a jailbroken device, as soon as you have a rooted device, you now have the potential for malware to get underneath whatever solution you had in place. And that's something that we want to control through policy. I mean, if you don't do anything else, please, please, please think long and hard about allowing your employees to have jailbroken or rooted devices, because it is really hard to guarantee any level of security if you're going to allow that in your organization. App-to-app data sharing and doc sharing. I talked about this a little bit earlier. For those of you using iOS, iOS 7, early in their last major release, introduced a number of enterprise features, a number of security enhancements to be sure, allowing you to have managed applications. Unfortunately, some applications, key applications like Safari and email, aren't manageable. The idea that data can pass between applications in the clear should worry you. Even if you are using an MDM product, the fact of the matter is, as data moves from one app to another, it's written to disk, it's written to memory in the clear. And the operating system doesn't necessarily clean up after itself. So it doesn't take someone who knows what they're doing more than about 90 seconds to get a hold of all kinds of interesting data that's been written to disk between applications. It's an incredible vulnerability. We want to make sure that we can allow people to be productive. We don't want to constrain them to just email. We actually want them to be able to get work done. I think one of the interesting things, and our previous speaker pointed out that, for example, file sharing is becoming more and more interesting to folks. Once you give people, email, calendar, contacts, that sort of information, it's almost inevitable that the very next thing they want is, okay, now I want access to files, not just the files that are in my email attachments, but I want to be able to get at the file servers, to get at a quote form, to get at something that's going to help me be more productive. And so being able to assemble solutions between different apps to allow me to be productive becomes very important. And then last, I want to extend this productivity, not just to employees, but as I've mentioned several times now, extend this out to business partners, for example. So firewalls are really interesting creatures. Those of us who have managed them, will tell you that there are no shortage of tools that help us identify ports that are open and which ones should be shut. Most IT folks are very, very busy trying to figure out which ports they can shut down. If there were ever a tool other than maybe DNS that gets kind of detritus and cruft that builds up over time, you often will get requests to open a port in the firewall in order to have certain information be accessible. Seldom, if ever, does someone come back later after they're done with that application and tell you it's okay to close up that port in the firewall. And so firewalls can protect, but they also prevent information. So if I want to get an information in the back office, that firewall is a barrier between my mobile device and getting at that information. By the same token, though, depending on what carrier I'm using and what operating system I'm using, many mobile devices also have a firewall that would prevent a back office application from being able to deliver data to that device. And so you really have to worry about both sides of that particular equation. Come on. So what we've done here is, in our approach, what we do, so that we don't have to rely on things like VPNs, is we allow the back office system to establish a secure connection with the NOC. We allow the device to establish a secure connection with the NOC. And now what we can do is we can move encrypted information across that pipe with impunity between a specific application on the device and a specific resource on the back end. That's very different, for example, than allowing a VPN, which would give that device access to everything on the network, right? This ability to specifically and uniquely tie an app to a specific resource on the back end. Much more secure. You're providing much more constraint on what can be accessed. So what we want to do is we want to allow for the access of corporate data behind the firewall. We want to do so without having to require a VPN. If you put an MDM in place, while you may be able to provide access to things like email, the second your employee wants to do something like access the corporate intranet. Sounds so innocent. I want to access the corporate intranet. Unless you're going to provide a VPN, they have no way of doing that. And so we want to think about, what do they need beyond email? What are those next applications that they're going to want, the file access, that we want to provide access but limit exposure? We want to make sure that however we do this, we do have strong crypto in place. We have thought through the security model, that we don't have a patchwork quilt of different systems where there's surface area for attack or leakage. The other thing that we've noticed, especially in a post-Snowden world, is depending on your geography, if you compare and contrast, for example, Europe with North America, privacy is thought about very differently. Privacy in North America tends to be thought about from the corporate perspective as a legal issue to be dealt with. Privacy in Europe is almost a human right. It's thought about from the perspective of the individual, and there's a number of laws to enforce that fact. It's one of the reasons why technologies like MDM, which provide an employer fairly unfettered access to an employee's device, cause so much angst because they don't want to have that view into the employee's privacy. It causes them problems. What we can do is, on an app-by-app basis, we can actually bypass the NOC and provide what's called direct connect. So we can establish full control on an app-by-app basis of what the data path is. So for example, let's go back to that browsing example. Maybe I want my employee to be able to access and download videos. Maybe they're training videos that we have on our corporate intranet. Well, for latency reasons, for performance reasons, geographic reasons, I want as much performance as possible to effectively use that bandwidth. I want to establish a direct connection from the mobile device directly to that resource behind the firewall. I still want to maintain security, but I don't want to have to be routing information to places it doesn't belong. That's a performance reason. You may have security reasons or privacy reasons where you want to ensure that the path of your data is routed directly. That is certainly something that we can support with this architecture. Again, we talked a little bit about the platform before, this idea that I have a common platform upon which I can build all of my services, the services that allow me to maintain visibility in those things that I'm giving my users, as well as be able to construct applications, purchase applications, and do so cross-platform. We talked a little bit earlier about the person on the other end of the support phone, wondering well, what device, what OS, what form factor. Well, with this model, I can care an awful lot less about that because the collaboration apps that I've given them work in a very similar way, regardless of what specific device they're using. Now, the collaboration suite provides you email, calendar, contacts, a secure way to manage documents, a secure web browser. This idea of having a secure web browser solves that problem I mentioned earlier of providing intranet access. Or the web applications that perhaps you've already created and are providing to your desktop users, those can now be deployed to your mobile users as well without having to think about how do I have a VPN to deal with access to them. I can give them a secure web browser, put it on their tablet, and they have full secure access to that back office resource. From a platform perspective, we can give you the tools you need to have analytics, to ensure manageability. Imagine a system, for those of you who manage email, most people can think of a few different reasons why email might be interrupted. Maybe I've got poor network coverage, poor cell coverage. Maybe something went wrong with my email app. Maybe the Exchange server's messed up. Okay, I've just named 4. But if you really dive deep, there's over a dozen different things that can go wrong. What we need is mobile service management that give you a full view of what's going on in your organization from the carrier down to the device. I mean, I want to know when things are trending toward not working. I don't want to know after the fact that, oh, by the way, your VIPs are no longer getting email. I don't want the 2 a.m. call. What I do want is I want the visibility that the platform provides that tells me, I've got an Exchange ActiveSync device out there that's generating an unusual number of requests on my Exchange server. And while things are working now, performance is degrading, not just for that user, but for everybody on that Exchange server. And if I don't do something about it, I may lose that server. Knowing that before it actually happens is really important. It's especially important, it's especially difficult as we think about the fact that many of us have multiple platforms and systems in use. Many of our customers have an existing legacy BlackBerry population for their field sales folks. They're thinking about or have already enabled BYOD, so they have employees bringing in Windows Phone, iOS, Android. So they're maintaining an existing population. They've got a new population coming in. Each vendor's product makes use of Enterprise ActiveSync differently. Each client uses it differently. And I need a view of that whole thing. Having a view of just part of the elephant, as it were, doesn't work. I need visibility. I can't keep this running as a tier 1 system without visibility. And then the ecosystem. The ecosystem is so important, where ISVs and organizations such as yourself can create custom applications without a lot of hassle. The idea that most end users have about how long it should take to do something. They've now become trained that they can hold up a credit card, go to an app store, and download their IT. They don't think twice about it. And so, having IT tell them that, it'll take 6 months, we'll have a conversation about it, and we'll see what we can do, just doesn't work. And so part of the idea here is, how do you provide tools that make it easier to create custom applications, that make it faster to create custom applications? You may have great developers in-house, or maybe have a relationship with an ISV app house that creates custom apps. They may know a lot about a particular way to create a business dashboard for your sales folks. They may not know all that much about security. In the last decade or so, I've met about 6 people I would actually trust to do a secure crypto implementation. It's non-trivial. You can go out and buy a book on applied cryptography, and it'll give you an algorithm, it'll give you a hunk of code, but how you implement that code is oh so critical, and where you implement that code is very critical. And so giving a tool set that allows any developer to take an SDK and be able to know that the resulting application is going to be on the platform and be able to avail itself of all the security and policy controls that are there without necessarily having to become a security expert is really important. Now, one of the things that many of us don't think about as we're trying to allow our folks to use mobile devices is the difference between the feature set that the various vendors make available to people on these consumer devices. Right? These are consumer devices. I've got a few of them. I love them. They work great for me in my personal life. But the reality of it is, I need a slightly different feature set. I need an enhanced feature set for me to be productive in my business life. On my personal device, I can create a meeting. I've got a calendar. I can even invite someone to a meeting. But in my business life, when I'm trying to juggle getting 8 people into a room, perhaps in different geographies, it'd be kind of nice to know whether they're even available. So things like free busy information, which we take for granted on the desktop when we're using Outlook on our PC, well, of course you can see who's available. Why on earth would I want to sacrifice that or give it up on my mobile device? And yet, the consumer apps that come with your mobile device don't necessarily offer those kinds of features that are required for you to be productive as a business professional. Same thing with things like phone numbers. Your mobile phones do a great job dialing a phone number. But as a business professional, I would bet 3/4 of the calls I'm on require a conference code that goes along with that phone number. And I know I shouldn't be doing it when I'm driving, but finding that conference code and getting that entered in is a real pain in the butt. What should happen is I should be able to touch that meeting and have it dial the phone and dial the conference call number to get me into that meeting. Again, these are very simple examples, but real examples about how my business life differs from my personal life. Being able to do this without sacrificing the individual native experience, if you will. If I'm an iOS user, I want things to look like iOS. It's not necessarily going to look like Apple Mail, but all the characteristics that go with iOS should be there. Same thing with Android. I made a choice as a user to have a specific operating system because I wanted that experience. And then last, things like single sign-on. I don't want to have to authenticate every time I switch apps. I've seen implementations out there where literally every time you go to a different app, because it came from a different vendor and it's on a different stack, I've got to authenticate again. Mobile is used differently than our desktops. I mean, think about it. You're at an airport and you're on the airport shuttle moving from terminal A to terminal D. I've got 45 seconds before the door opens. I'd like to be able to take out my mobile device, check an email, maybe type a quick response, and send it back. But if I do that, and I first got to fire up a VPN, I've got to authenticate, I've got to wait for that to occur, then fire up the it gets to the point where the hassle factor or the time factor suddenly makes that kind of interaction not possible. And so something like single sign-on becomes really critical for making folks productive on mobile devices. From a developer perspective, developers should be able to create apps using the architectures, using the tool sets that work for them and that specific solution. Maybe a native app development is the right way to go. Maybe I'm writing an Android app and I'm using Eclipse. I should be able to use that. But by the same token, maybe I've got some great HTML5 and CSS talent in my corporation. They're not necessarily hacking C++, but I've got some talent that can make use of some of these new tools like Adobe PhoneGap or IBM Worklight that allow them to create apps. We should be able to support that. And again, I talked about web apps. We have existing web apps that we'd like to provide access to, or perhaps that's our strategy going forward to accommodate both our desktop users and our mobile users. We'll create it as a web app and use a secure browser to provide access. The point here is that you want a system that accommodates the architectures and doesn't constrain you to a specific architecture. This is really cool, shared services. So many people know good technology for the security, for the email, and other collaboration tools that we provide. One of the interesting things that we pioneered last year was shared services. And so our apps, the apps that our ISVs create, the apps that you create on our platform, can actually share services through a publish and subscribe model. So for example, we have a vendor, Hewlett-Packard. HP has an app called ePrint. ePrint does secure mobile printing. If you are creating a custom app in your organization, you don't want to have to write code that does printing. Wouldn't it be better to simply subscribe to the function that HP's already created and consume that function within your app? And so you essentially can create a print button in your app and tie it to the HP service that's being published. And the user, from the user's perspective, they never leave your app. They're in your custom app, they hit the print button, magic happens, document prints. This is all accomplished through what's called a shared service. We can do the same thing for things like access to SharePoint. I mean, who wants to learn the innards of SharePoint simply to get access to a file? If you can simply subscribe to that same service because someone's made that available. And so we'll see more and more of this kind of thinking that allows us to create app mashups, right? That allows us to take the functions we need, the apps we need, and bring them together to make people productive. We're no longer constrained by the strict boundaries of what's in a given app. And so we see shared services as a very exciting way to reduce development cycles, right? Because you're spending less time actually writing code, you're spending less time QAing that code, and of course, the regression testing that goes with that, all in a desire to get mobile applications out to your users as quickly as possible. Again, I had talked earlier about the ecosystem. It's a rich ecosystem, and many of these apps also support shared services. And so the idea here is that not only are there apps, there's an app for that, but there's apps that work together, they share data in a secure fashion, and many of them, again, support shared services as well. And we'll see more and more of this as we go forward. So let me give you an example of a secure multi-app workflow. We've got no shortage of examples, and I'd love to talk to you at the break about your specific business. I probably know customers that are doing things that pertain. But a good example that we can probably relate to both from an IT perspective as well as an end user perspective. We've got insurance companies that use our products and our ISV's products. And remember the old days where if you had an automobile accident, you'd have to make an appointment for an insurance adjuster. They'd come out, they'd have a binder full of forms, they'd be lugging a camera with them. They'd have to fill out the paperwork, take pictures. They'd submit that back to headquarters. You'd wait for all that paperwork to be reviewed. It'd come back. Eventually, someday, hopefully, you got a check and some indication as to where to take your car to get it fixed. We've now have a number of customers who have completely automated that using mobile devices where they can take a tool like Box where they store all the appropriate forms depending on what type of incident it is. They go out in the field with their tablet. They're able to get that form securely from the corporate repository. They're able to then annotate that PDF form, fill out the various fields that are needed for that specific customer. They're able to use the onboard camera, not have the picture go into the consumer side of the device, but stay inside of the business area, if you will, and even have the customer, once shown the information, use their finger and sign the document that they approve this, and have that be the beginning of an automated kickoff so they can get their check that much quicker. And so what these customers are seeing is not only an increase in field worker productivity, how many customers can they handle, but seeing an increase in customer satisfaction, because the customer's problem is getting handled that much faster, they're getting their check that much faster. It's a very simple example, but you can take those same tools and apply it to a field sales worker who's perhaps doing quotes on goods or services that you sell, and they want to provide a quote to a customer, and provide that quote, fill out the form, have the customer sign it. Same three apps, providing a very different end result. But these things can be snapped together almost like building blocks to create different solutions. Trying. So, some closing thoughts. We want to focus on improving user productivity, right? Mobile is a great way to be able to do that. And I think if we think about it, one of the things that we'd like to do is we'd like to get people moved from the stage of being able to monitor business. When I first got my smartphone and I first got email on it, I was able to see email. I didn't author all that many because I didn't want to, and I couldn't have access to files, and so there was a whole class of interactions that I'll wait until I get back to the office. I'll wait until I get back to my laptop or desktop. I don't want to just monitor business. I want to participate in business. And so being able to give your folks the tools needed to actively participate in business, where their mobile device or devices can actually be primary tools rather than conveniences, that's where we want to head. We want to provide a consistent experience to our users. Selfishly, it makes it easier for us to support, but it also makes them happier and more productive as well, especially in an era where they have multiple devices, to have solutions where they can have a reasonable expectation that whether they pick up their tablet or their smartphone, that the apps that you've provided them are going to work more or less the same is actually really important in terms of how fast they can come up to speed and how fast they can be productive. Containerization provides us a great way to not only protect your business assets, but frankly protect the privacy of the end user. Because by definition, it means that you don't have to care or be concerned about what apps and personal data they have on their device. I mean, regardless of your ownership model, many of you indicated that you didn't have immediate plans to support BYOD. Even if your plan is to own the device, mobile devices are inherently personal. I mean, my gosh, a decade ago when I carried a BlackBerry, I didn't describe it as, this is my company's phone. That's my phone. People are inherently attached to their mobile devices. They treat them as their personal devices, whether you buy them or whether they buy them. And I guarantee you, they've got their personal information, their personal fingerprints all over that device. And so we need to think through that in order to make them productive and secure. And then last, I think there's a lot of off-the-shelf wins that we can create. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love custom app development. I've seen some incredible things be created on mobile devices. But the reality of it is there are some really quick wins that can be accomplished, some really effective solutions that can be created by creating these secure workflows, by taking ISV apps, combining them with collaboration apps, and providing those out as solutions, end-to-end solutions that make people productive. So hopefully I've given you some things to think about. I look forward to speaking with you all during the breaks. Thank you very much.